Jump scares. Horrible freaking jump scares. If you've ever seen a horror movie before, then you'll know that this tactic of scaring the audience is one of the most essential and yet most played out and annoying tricks of the trade. It's an obnoxious cliche that is put in movies for a couple of equally stupid reasons. 1. Jump scares are marketable, and they're often used solely to make a trailer that dumb kids on YouTube can make reactions to.
Hello.
And 2, people are conditioned to expect them from a horror movie at this point. And a lot of those same people equate being scared with being jolted by some loud noise or a visual that comes at a surprise to the viewer. Jump scares are also easy to implement, for a false scare can be as simple as showing like a bird flying by and then throwing in some ridiculously loud sound effect. These are, from what I can tell at least, the reasons why jump scares are so prevalent in contemporary horror movies. But what I'd like to argue before presenting my main point is that on its own terms, a jump scare isn't inherently a bad thing. This is because of the fact that it's something that people just, like I said earlier, expect from a horror movie. When someone watches an action movie, it's usually expected that there will be a shootout and or a car chase. A comedy is expected to have a lot of jokes, and depending on what specific kind of comedy you're watching, you might have certain expectations of what jokes you'll get. A murder mystery generally has a scene where the detective sorts through all the facts and summarizes that information into some earth-shattering reveal. I could address a lot more examples, but you probably understand what I'm getting at. With certain genres come certain narrative expectations along with them, and for horror, the most basic assumption is that the movie is trying to scare you. More specifically, the common perception people have is that they anticipate being jolted by some creepy image or a loud sound effect in order for the film to scare them. In my opinion, the grand majority of jump scares are terrible. They're predictable, annoying, and signs that a studio is trying to compensate for a lack of genuine suspense in their movie. But there are examples of when jump scares have worked for me, and here are some of my personal favorites. Here's one from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Sally, I hear something. Stop. Stop.
There's this great moment from Poltergeist. And I always get goosebumps from this scene in The Babadook. In these cases, it isn't just the fact that there is something that causes me to clench up from shock and surprise. To make these moments work, there is a critical element of these truly great movies that makes the jump scares really work, and that is suspense. For me, I'm much more invested in a horror movie when I can feel the tension building, and the fear I experience comes from a combination of the story itself and the atmosphere built around that story. That's why a movie like John Carpenter's The Thing is so fantastic, because it focuses so much more on harnessing the natural tension of its situation rather than berating the audience with one lame, tension-diffusing jump scare after another. I have brought all this up to eventually circle back to a point I wanted to make. When all is said and done, I can only think of one movie I've seen in my lifetime that tackles this approach perfectly, delivering what I consider to be one of the greatest, if not the absolute greatest, jump scare of all time, and that movie is Wait Until Dark. If you have never seen this movie, just go ahead and stop the video now and watch it, because for one thing, it is a truly great film and very much deserves your time, but also because I will be spoiling pretty much the entire thing. You have been warned! The year was 1967. British director Terence Young had received a fair amount of praise for his work on 3 James Bond films starring Sean Connery. By the way, news of his passing came up on the internet as I was editing this morning. May the legend himself rest in peace. But now he had completed work on a much different project on a significantly smaller scale called Wait Until Dark, which is an adaptation of the stage play of the same name, which debuted on Broadway the year prior. In this film version, our story is not exactly delivered in the same tone as other horror movies I've already mentioned in this video, or most other horror movies in general for that matter. Rather, it gradually evolves from a mystery into a contained thriller, the likes of which, as I alluded to earlier, has one of the greatest jump scares ever. We'll eventually get there in the discussion, but let's examine the movie by going through it in chronological order. As you can see here in this first scene, the film opens with a haunting vignette of a lady named Lisa transporting a doll laced up with baggies of drugs. Suspense is already established right from the start here, given that the chilling music foreshadows precarious events to become. This only becomes more of a sure thing as the opening credits come to a close, for after we see the woman pass off the doll to another stranger in a Manhattan airport, she's then escorted off in the opposite direction of the doll's new courier. A flash forward to a few days later provides us with our first real clue into the story, in which we're introduced to our three conmen. There's the self-assured Mike Tallman, played by Richard Crenna on the right, the not as self-assured Carlino, played by Jack Weston on the left, and last but certainly not least, the smooth, clever, and calculated Rote, a man played by Alan Arkin who could more or less be labeled as a confident career criminal. What proceeds in this fascinating, tense encounter between these three men is that they've met to discuss their plan to obtain the drug-laden doll. Rote is convinced that the doll is hidden somewhere in this New York apartment, which is rented out to the photographer whom Lisa passed the doll to in the airport. Even though the men are distinct in their personalities and methods of pulling off cons, they agree to work together to obtain the doll by whatever means necessary, aside from getting their hands dirty, so to speak. Amazingly, all of these plot details and stakes for the story are established at least 20 minutes into the film, even before we've met our protagonist Susie Hendricks that was portrayed by the ever-lovely Audrey Hepburn. If the setup for the story wasn't already the stuff of top-notch cinematic suspense, then the detail we quickly learn about Susie raises that tension to much, much higher levels. After all, she returns to the apartment as they're conspiring right in the middle of her living room. You would think, just like these con men, that they're done for and would get caught for breaking and entering at least, but instead, Susie ignores and bypasses them all, wandering around the house as if everything was normal. It's in this way that the movie communicates something extremely crucial about Susie's character, in that she's blind. As if Susie wasn't already at a disadvantage due to being outnumbered by three unpredictable criminals inside her home, this sensory handicap only tips the scales away from her more. But don't worry, we'll get to that. Eventually, after these men leave to plot their seizure of their doll, we see Susie enjoying a quiet evening with her husband Sam. We learn both from her exchanges with Sam and later with her very young neighbor Gloria that she hasn't been blind from birth, but rather that it was inflicted upon her due to a horrible car accident a year earlier. As such, she may be able to competently maneuver through her apartment and do some basic chores, but her struggle to cope with blindness is undeniable. What she may lack in sight, she compensates with a strong will and cleverness, the likes of which she has to put to good use once the con men initiate their grand plan. For the entirety of the second act, the events that take place mount the tension that had already been building from the beginning. On one hand, Rote, Carlino, and Mike Tallman all worked hard to trick Susie into getting the wrong idea about Lisa's death, framing the story as though Sam Hendricks, her husband, could be implied as a suspect in a murder case. And so, as they slowly but slyly execute their devious plans by impersonating various individuals that come into their home, Susie offers her kind help while not dismissing her confused suspicion over everything. But on the other hand, Terrence Young was careful about how he framed and cut together shots. He honored the fact that Wait Until Dark was conceived as a stage play first, by keeping his camera inside the apartment for most of the film. This tactic never gets boring though, because even the most insignificant details such as furniture arrangements and placement of props make a difference in this story. As was established by the principle of Chekhov's gun, if in Act 1 you have a pistol hanging on the wall, then it must fire in the last act. Wait Until Dark utilizes this idea to great effect as the film draws nearer to its climax, for with the help of Gloria, Susie eventually figures out that things are out of place. Various elements of the set design and props play integral roles in building suspense, such as Susie having recognized the squeakiness of Roche's shoes, taking notice of the con men opening and shutting her blinds at very specific moments, and top of all that, becoming mortified by a coded message she receives from Gloria about what the con men's true intentions are. It's at this point where things really start to get serious, in which the story itself as well as its visual realization prove to the audience just why the movie is so suspenseful. If a generic contemporary horror film had been building up to the third act, there already would have been a ton of jump scares inserted to jolt the viewer into keeping attention. But what this actually does is build up a bunch of false quote-unquote tension and making the viewer brace themselves for the noise themselves, as opposed to something that isn't genuinely scary. This is why I respect the last 20 to 30 minutes of Wait Until Dark so much, because this ending earns every single moment of shocking suspense and thrills it goes for. There hadn't been a single jump scare or cheap thrill-seeking trick up to this point, rather a reliance on character interactions with solid dialogue and attention to details. There's every reason to feel scared for Susie, because not only is she a lone housewife having to face off against three unpredictable and dangerous men, but her blindness puts her at an automatic disadvantage. Not to mention that the con men cut the phone lines and tampered with her door locks, leaving her home practically defenseless. And even after Susie does what she can to even the playing field by destroying destroying most of the light bulbs and hiding the doll in a safe place, there's not a single guarantee that she would come out of this situation unscathed. You only begin to feel this more as we see Rote kill both of his associates, one by running him over repeatedly, and the other by stabbing him in the back with a switchblade, leaving the conflict to be just between him and Susie. Every little thing has been building to this pivotal moment, the scene where the stakes have reached their peak. Susie is now in the worst possible situation she could possibly be in, for her phone line has been cut, her husband is at a place where he can't be communicated at, Gloria has gone out to get help but there's no telling when she'll return, and now Susie is stuck home alone with 2 dead criminals and a cunning man who wouldn't hesitate to kill her to get what he wants. So with the threat of gasoline and a knife-wielding villain making poor Susie's chances of survival even slimmer, how could it even get more suspenseful than this? Well, this is how.
Are you looking at me?
Yes, it...
Stop! Don't touch that!
I have your knife, Mr. Rote.
And I've got the matches, Mrs. Hendricks.
These matches and the sounds coming from Rote's tapping are the last things that are keeping Susie from surviving. But if that wasn't enough to make the audience be invested in her predicament, this scene helps to bridge the gap between the character and the viewer, since the absence of light and the increased emphasis on sound heightens one's sensory awareness, much like how it would be for Susie on a normal basis. Eventually, when it seems like all is lost for Susie, she gains the upper hand and manages to stab Rote in a surprise attack. However, even then, it's not over, because Susie still has to try to call for help.
Help!
Only for this to then happen seconds later. There it is, folks. One of the best jump scares of all time. A moment of shock and surprise that isn't just great because of how well it works on an audience that's caught off guard, but also because it has a genuine threat associated with it. This isn't some lame, false scare that's meant to force the viewer to keep watching. This is scary because the character has every reason to be scared of her assailant, and as such, we as the audience are scared along with Susie, since we're fearful of her life in what is an iconic and riveting climax to an above-average home invasion thriller. In conclusion, I know that for much of this I had just been re-summarizing the events of the movie, and in retrospect, Wait Until Dark isn't really that scary compared to other movies. I would imagine that people who have seen a lot of horror movies would agree with me. But that's the thing that makes Wait Until Dark, especially its incredible jump scare, work so well. It's not focused on the simple act of scaring the audience. The director made sure to tell a tense, suspenseful, and compelling story first, and then the scares come second, or in this case, the scare. This cast and crew knew what they were building to, so they asked the audience to be patient, and once the moment comes, it delivers great delayed gratification. So many horror films fail to live up to this standard because they're made under the assumption that all you need are cliched scenes of people slowly walking down hallways, opening doors, seeing nothing in the mirror, only to turn around and see something spooky. That might be suspenseful sometimes, but for the most part, it's lazy and tired filmmaking, unlike what you see here. If a director really wants to pull off a good scare, they need to remember why Wait Until Dark is so respected among certain groups of cinephiles. Give an audience good characters, establish a sense of space in the set you're shooting in, and then present a legitimate threat. This 1967 classic has all of those things and more, and in my opinion, it has set a standard for pulling off a jump scare that few other films have managed to live up to. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed my Halloween special. It was very fun making this video, and I hope you stay safe with your festivities tonight. If you like this content, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss out on what I have to offer in the future. Thank you so much for checking this out, and happy Halloween!